I never imagined that hanging a set of wind chimes on my back porch in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, would turn into a 6-month nightmare that nearly cost me my home. But that's exactly what happened when Patricia Hendricks decided she hated the sound of tubular bells swaying in the desert breeze. It started on a Tuesday morning in late March when I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky orange and pink over the Superstition Mountains. I had moved into this quiet neighborhood in Gilbert about 8 months earlier, shortly after my divorce finalized. The house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a decent-sized backyard, and I had spent most of my free time making it feel like home again. The wind chimes were a housewarming gift from my sister, a beautiful set of copper tubes that created this peaceful, melodic sound whenever the wind picked up. She had bought them from a local artisan in Sedona, and they were honestly one of my favorite things about the property. I heard the doorbell ring just as I was finishing my first cup of coffee. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a woman I had only seen in passing at neighborhood gatherings. She was probably in her mid-50s, with severely highlighted blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, wearing a crisp white polo shirt with the Sagaro Hills HOA logo embroidered on the chest. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her eyes had that particular gleam that I would come to recognize as the look of someone who lived for confrontation. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound friendly despite the early hour and her unwelcoming expression. "Can I help you?" "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Sagaro Hills Homeowners Association," she announced, her voice sharp and clipped. "I'm here about the unauthorized noise pollution device you've installed on your property." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "The wind chimes," she said, gesturing vaguely toward my backyard. "They're creating an unacceptable level of noise that's disturbing the peace of this neighborhood. I've received multiple complaints." I actually laughed, thinking she must be joking. "You're talking about the wind chimes on my back porch. They're barely audible from the street," her expression hardened. "Mr. Davidson, this is not a laughing matter. Our HOA covenant clearly states that residents must maintain a peaceful environment and refrain from activities that create excessive noise. Your wind chimes violate that covenant." "Patricia, with all due respect, they're wind chimes. They make a soft tinkling sound when there's a breeze. They're not speakers blasting music or a dog barking all night." "That's your opinion," she snapped. "I happen to find the constant clanging to be extremely disruptive, especially considering I live directly behind you. Every time the wind blows, which is constantly in Arizona, I'm subjected to that incessant noise." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "Look, I understand if you personally don't like the sound, but I really don't think it's loud enough to qualify as a noise violation." "Maybe we could." "I'm not here to negotiate," Patricia interrupted. "I'm here to inform you that you have 72 hours to remove those wind chimes, or the HOA will begin fining you. We take our community standards very seriously here in Sagaro Hills." She thrust a formal-looking letter into my hands and turned on her heel, marching back down my driveway before I could respond. I stood there in my doorway, staring at the letter in disbelief. It was typed on official HOA letterhead, complete with citations of various covenant sections and subsections. The letter demanded immediate removal of the noise-generating devices and threatened daily fines of $50 if I failed to comply. I spent the rest of that morning reading through my copy of the HOA covenants, which I had received when I purchased the house, but admittedly had only skimmed. The section Patricia referenced talked about maintaining peace and quiet in the neighborhood and prohibited excessive or unreasonable noise. But there was nothing specific about wind chimes, and certainly nothing that defined what constituted excessive or unreasonable. It was all vague language that seemed designed to give the HOA board maximum flexibility to enforce whatever they wanted. That evening, I walked over to my neighbor's house on the left side, an older gentleman named Robert who had been friendly since I moved in. He was watering his desert landscape when I approached. "Hey Robert, can I ask you something? Do my wind chimes bother you?" He looked up confused. "Your wind chimes? I didn't even know you had wind chimes. Where are they?" "On my back porch." Apparently, Patricia Hendricks thinks they're too loud. Robert snorted. "Of course she does. Patricia thinks everything is too loud. Last year, she tried to get the Johnsons fined because their kids were playing basketball in their driveway on a Saturday afternoon. Said the bouncing ball was disrupting her meditation time. Are you serious?" As a heart attack. "She's been HOA president for 3 years now, and she's made life miserable for half the neighborhood. Most people just do whatever she says because it's easier than fighting her. She's got nothing better to do than patrol the streets looking for violations." This conversation made me feel somewhat vindicated, but also concerned. I didn't want to spend my time and energy fighting with an HOA president who apparently had too much time on her hands. At the same time, the principle of the thing bothered me. These were nice wind chimes that created a pleasant ambient sound. They weren't hurting anyone. I decided to do some research. Over the next 2 days, I dove deep into Arizona state laws regarding noise ordinances. What I discovered was fascinating. Gilbert, like most Arizona cities, had specific sound ordinance laws that defined exactly what constituted a noise violation. The ordinances specified maximum decibel levels for different times of day and different types of zones. Residential areas had a limit of 55 decibels during daytime hours and 50 decibels during nighttime hours, measured from the property line. I ordered a professional-grade sound meter online with expedited shipping. It arrived the next day, a Thursday, which gave me less than 24 hours before Patricia's 72-hour deadline. That afternoon, when the desert wind was blowing pretty consistently, I went outside and measured the sound levels at various points around my property. Standing directly under the wind chimes, the sound meter registered about 48 decibels. At my back property line, where Patricia's yard began, it dropped to 35 decibels. At my front property line facing the street, it was barely measurable above the ambient neighborhood noise, coming in at around 32 decibels. For context, a normal conversation registers at about 60 decibels, and a whisper is about 30 decibels. My wind chimes were literally quieter than people talking. Armed with this data, I typed up a formal response to Patricia's letter. I cited the specific Gilbert City ordinance codes, included my sound measurements with timestamps and photos of the meter readings, and politely explained that my wind chimes were well within legal limits and did not violate any reasonable interpretation of the HOA covenants. I hand-delivered a copy to Patricia's house that evening. She answered the door wearing yoga pants and a t-shirt, clearly not expecting visitors. Her expression soured immediately when she saw me. "Mr. Davidson. Patricia, I wanted to give you this response to your letter. I've done some research on the noise ordinances, and I think you'll find that my wind chimes are well within acceptable limits." She didn't even look at the papers I was holding out. "The HOA covenants supersede city ordinances. We have the right to enforce higher standards within our community." Actually, that's not quite accurate. HOA covenants can't violate or contradict local laws, and the city ordinances provide clear, objective standards for what constitutes a noise violation. "Are you a lawyer, Mr. Davidson?" "No, but..." "Then I suggest you don't pretend to be one. The HOA board has reviewed your situation and determined that your wind chimes constitute a violation. If they're not removed by tomorrow morning, you'll begin accruing fines. That's final." She closed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, my jaw clenched in frustration, then slid my response letter through her mail slot. Friday morning came and went. I didn't remove the wind chimes. I had decided that I wasn't going to be bullied into compliance when I was clearly in the right. At noon, I received another letter from the HOA, this time delivered by certified mail. It informed me that I was now in violation and would be fined $50 per day until the issue was resolved. The letter also stated that continued non-compliance could result in a lien being placed on my property. That escalated quickly. I had heard stories about HOAs run amok, but I had never experienced it firsthand. The idea that I could potentially lose my home over wind chimes seemed absurd, but the legal language in the letter was no joke. I needed help. I spent Friday afternoon calling lawyers. The first 3 I spoke with didn't handle HOA disputes. The fourth, a woman named Jessica Martinez, specialized in exactly this type of case. She agreed to meet with me Monday morning. Over the weekend, I documented everything. I took more sound measurements at different times of day. I recorded video of the wind chimes during various wind conditions, including the audio levels. I photographed the chimes from different angles and distances. I also walked around the neighborhood and noted at least 7 other houses that had wind chimes, bird feeders with bells, or decorative metal sculptures that made noise in the wind. I documented all of those as well. On Sunday afternoon, my neighbor on the right side, a woman named Sandra with 2 teenage kids, came over looking nervous. "Hey, I heard you're having trouble with Patricia about your wind chimes," she said quietly, glancing around as if Patricia might be watching. Word travels fast. "She came by my house yesterday and asked if your wind chimes bothered me. I told her no, honestly, I can barely hear them, but she seemed really angry about it. She kept saying you were setting a bad precedent and that if we let one person break the rules, soon everyone would." That's interesting, considering there are wind chimes on at least 6 other houses in this neighborhood. Sandra nodded. She's selective about enforcement. The Hendersons' 3 streets over have this massive wind chime setup that you can hear from a block away. But Patricia never says anything to them because Mrs. Henderson is on the HOA board with her. This just kept getting better. Selective enforcement was actually something I could use in my defense. Monday morning, I met with Jessica Martinez at her office in downtown Gilbert. She was in her early 40s, sharply dressed, with an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. I showed her all my documentation, the letters from Patricia, the HOA covenants, and my research on the noise ordinances. She reviewed everything carefully, occasionally nodding or making notes. After about 30 minutes, she looked up at me. "You've got a strong case." The selective enforcement angle is particularly useful. HOAs are required to enforce their rules consistently, and if they're allowing some residents to have wind chimes while prohibiting others, that's a problem. Plus, your sound measurements clearly show you're not violating any objective noise standards. So what do I do? First, we're going to request a formal hearing with the HOA board. That's your right under the covenants. We'll present your evidence and demand they dismiss the violation. If they refuse, we'll take it to mediation, and if that doesn't work, we'll file suit. "How much is this going to cost me?" She gave me a sympathetic look. "HOA litigation can be expensive, but here's the thing. If we win, which I think we will, the HOA will likely have to pay your legal fees. These covenants include a fee-shifting provision for prevailing parties." I hired her on the spot. She drafted a formal request for a hearing, citing all the relevant sections of the covenants and Arizona HOA law. We submitted it that afternoon. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in April. The HOA board meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed a fitness center and a pool. I arrived 15 minutes early with Jessica. Patricia was already there along with the other 4 board members. Tom Henderson, whose wife had the massive wind chimes Sandra had mentioned, Karen Schultz, a retired teacher, David Park, a software engineer, and Michelle Torres, a nurse who worked nights and usually looked exhausted at these evening meetings. The clubhouse meeting room had about 30 folding chairs set up, and maybe a dozen other residents were there, apparently interested in the proceedings. I recognized Sandra in the back row, giving me a supportive nod. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp bang of her gavel. She went through some routine business first, approving the minutes from the last meeting and discussing some upcoming neighborhood events. Then she got to my case. Next, we have the matter of 847 Desert Willow Drive and the ongoing noise violation. Mr. Davidson has requested a hearing to contest the violation notice. Jessica stood up. Thank you, Madam President. For the record, I'm Jessica Martinez, representing Mr. Davidson in this matter. We're here today to present evidence that there is no violation and to request that the board dismiss all fines and penalties. Patricia's expression could have curdled milk. The board has already determined there is a violation. This hearing is simply to allow Mr. Davidson to explain why he believes he should receive special treatment. Actually, Jessica said calmly, under Section 7.3 of the HOA covenants, a hearing must provide a meaningful opportunity for the homeowner to contest the alleged violation and present evidence in their defense. The board is required to consider that evidence with an open mind before making a final determination. Karen Schultz leaned forward. What evidence do you have? Jessica began presenting our case methodically. She showed the sound measurements, explaining the Gilbert noise ordinances and how my wind chimes fell well below the legal thresholds. She presented photos and videos of the chimes, demonstrating their size and sound level. Then she brought out the photos of the other 7 properties in the neighborhood with similar or louder wind chimes and decorative items. The Henderson property, where board member Tom Henderson resides, has wind chimes that register at 52 decibels at the property line, significantly louder than Mr. Davidson's chimes. Yet no violation notice has been issued there. This constitutes selective enforcement, which violates both the HOA's own covenants and Arizona state law. Tom Henderson's face went red. That's completely different. Our chimes are, they're more musical. Musical is subjective, Jessica replied. Decibel level is objective. Either the HOA enforces a sound standard consistently, or it doesn't enforce it at all. Patricia interrupted. The complaints we've received about Mr. Davidson's wind chimes are about more than just volume. They're about the constant, repetitive nature of the sound. It's irritating. Who exactly has complained? Jessica asked. Patricia hesitated. That information is confidential. Actually, under Arizona Revised Statute 33/1804, a homeowner has the right to know who is making complaints against them. Transparency in enforcement is required. The room went silent. Patricia looked like she was chewing glass. Finally, she said, I've received complaints from concerned residents. How many residents? Several. Can you be more specific? Another long pause. David Park, the software engineer, cleared his throat. Patricia, I think we need to be straight here. How many complaints have you actually received? Patricia's jaw tightened. The number isn't relevant. Even one complaint requires us to investigate. So it's one complaint, Jessica said, and based on the fact that you live directly behind Mr. Davidson's property and you were the one who personally delivered the violation notice, I'm going to guess that the one complaint came from you. Is that correct? The other board members were looking at Patricia now with various expressions of surprise and discomfort. Michelle Torres actually looked a bit angry. My personal feelings don't matter, Patricia said defensively. I'm enforcing the covenants, selectively, Jessica pointed out, and based on subjective personal preference rather than objective standards. This is exactly the type of arbitrary enforcement that HOA law is designed to prevent. Tom Henderson spoke up. Look, I have to say, I think Jessica makes some good points. If we're going to enforce noise rules, we need to do it consistently and based on actual measurements, not just because someone personally doesn't like a sound. Karen Schultz nodded. I agree. I didn't realize other houses had wind chimes. It doesn't seem fair to single out Mr. Davidson. Patricia was looking increasingly isolated. We have the authority to enforce community standards. Within reason and within the law, David Park said. He looked at Jessica. You mentioned the city noise ordinance. What were Mr. Davidson's measurements again? Jessica repeated the numbers. David pulled out his phone and started looking something up. Yeah, I'm seeing here that Gilbert's daytime residential limit is 55 decibels at the property line. If he's measuring 35 at his back property line, that's well below the threshold. This isn't about legal limits, Patricia insisted, her voice rising. This is about maintaining the character and tranquility of our neighborhood. If we let this slide, what's next? Someone installs a fountain that runs all night. Someone puts up speakers. Slippery slope arguments aren't valid grounds for enforcement, Jessica said. Each situation needs to be evaluated on its own merits based on established, objective standards. Mr. Davidson's wind chimes meet every reasonable standard. There is no legitimate basis for this violation. Michelle Torres finally spoke up, her voice tired but firm. I make a motion to dismiss the violation and remove all fines against Mr. Davidson. I second, David Park said immediately. Patricia looked panicked. We should table this and discuss it further in executive session. I call for a vote, Michelle said, not backing down. Patricia had no choice. All in favor of dismissing the violation, 4 hands went up: Michelle, David, Karen, and Tom. Patricia sat rigidly, her hand down, outvoted 4-1. The motion carries, Patricia said through gritted teeth. The violation is dismissed. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Jessica gathered her materials calmly, thanked the board, and we left the meeting. Outside in the parking lot, I actually laughed. That was amazing, thank you. It was pretty clear-cut once we got them to acknowledge the selective enforcement. Patricia overplayed her hand. Do you think this is over? Jessica's expression grew more serious. Honestly, probably not. People like Patricia don't like losing, especially publicly. Keep documenting everything and call me if you receive any more letters or notices. She was right to be cautious. For the next 2 weeks, things were quiet. My wind chimes hung peacefully on my back porch, creating their gentle melody whenever the wind blew. I thought maybe Patricia had decided to let it go and move on. Then I got a citation from the HOA for my grass being 1/4 inch too long. Then another citation for a small oil stain on my driveway that had been there since before I moved in. Then a citation for my trash cans being visible from the street, even though I had only put them out the night before pickup, which was expressly allowed in the covenants. Over the course of May, I received 8 different citations for various petty violations. Some were legitimate if ridiculously nitpicky, others were completely fabricated. Jessica advised me to respond to each one in writing, documenting that either the violation didn't exist or had been immediately corrected, and noting the pattern of harassment. By early June, I had had enough. I started documenting Patricia's own property. Her front yard had some weeds growing in the rock landscape. Her house number plaque was slightly crooked. One of her window screens had a small tear. Her garage door had a scuff mark. I took photos of everything and submitted formal complaints to the HOA about each issue. 2 days later, Patricia showed up at my door, absolutely livid. How dare you submit frivolous complaints about my property? They're not frivolous, I said calmly. Your front yard landscaping violates Section 4.2 of the covenants regarding weed control. Your house numbers violate Section 5.8 regarding property identification standards. Should I go on? This is harassment. I agree. It is harassment. It's what you've been doing to me for 3 months. How does it feel? Her face was turning purple. You can't do this. I'm the HOA president. So you're exempt from the rules everyone else has to follow. That's interesting. I'm sure the other board members would love to hear about that philosophy. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I could make your life very difficult. You already are. But here's the thing, Patricia, I'm not backing down and I'm not moving. My wind chimes are legal, they're staying up, and if you continue to harass me with bogus violations, I'm going to file a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. They take HOA abuse seriously. "This isn't over," she hissed, then turned and stormed off. But the citations stopped. For about 3 weeks, I heard nothing from Patricia or the HOA. I actually started to relax, thinking maybe we had reached a détente. Then in late June, I received a notice that the HOA was proposing a covenant amendment. The amendment would specifically prohibit exterior decorative items that produce audible sound, including but not limited to wind chimes, bells, or similar devices. The notice stated that a vote would be held at the July HOA meeting, and that a 2/3 majority of homeowners would need to approve the amendment for it to pass. This was a new tactic. If Patricia couldn't enforce existing rules against my wind chimes, she would create a new rule specifically designed to ban them. I immediately called Jessica. She reviewed the proposed amendment and the notification procedures. The good news is that covenant amendments are hard to pass. Getting 2/3 of homeowners to vote, let alone vote in favor, is difficult. The bad news is that if it does pass, you'd have to comply or face legitimate violations. So what do? You show up at that meeting and you make your case to your neighbors, and you organize. Find out who else has wind chimes or similar decorations. Find out who thinks this amendment is overreach. Build a coalition. I spent the next 2 weeks going door to door in my neighborhood. It was eye-opening. I discovered that the Saguaro Hills HOA had about 230 homes, and Patricia had made herself unpopular with a significant portion of them. The list of people she had cited, harassed, or bullied over the years was extensive. I met Jerry, who had been fined $300 because his mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. I met Lisa, whose son's birthday party decorations resulted in a violation notice for excessive display of temporary signage because they had balloons tied to the mailbox. I met Robert and Susan, who had been forced to repaint their entire house because Patricia claimed the color was too bright, even though it was one of the pre-approved colors from the HOA's own palette. People were frustrated, but most felt powerless. Patricia had worn them down with relentless enforcement and the threat of expensive legal battles. "Here's the thing," I told them as I went door to door. "This amendment isn't really about wind chimes. It's about whether we want to live in a neighborhood where one person gets to dictate every tiny detail of our lives based on their personal preferences. If this passes, what's next?" She's already talking about banning garden gnomes and restricting what colors we can paint our front doors. That last part wasn't an exaggeration. Sandra had heard Patricia mention it at her recent board meeting during the discussion of future enhancement initiatives. By the time the July meeting rolled around, I had talked to over 100 homeowners. About 30 of them committed to attending the meeting to vote against the amendment. Another 20 said they would submit proxy votes against it. I had also created a simple one-page handout explaining why the amendment was unnecessary and overly restrictive, with citations to the existing noise ordinances and examples of Patricia's selective enforcement. The July meeting was packed. The clubhouse meeting room normally held 30 people comfortably, but there must have been 70 residents crammed in there that evening. People were standing along the walls and sitting on the floor. Patricia looked surprised and displeased by the turnout. The meeting began with the usual routine business, but everyone was clearly waiting for the main event. When Patricia finally brought up the proposed covenant amendment, the room immediately erupted in discussion. Patricia banged her gavel. "Order, we need order. I'll explain the reasoning behind this amendment, and then we'll hear public comment before voting." She launched into a prepared speech about maintaining property values and preserving the peaceful character of the neighborhood. She talked about auditory pollution and the importance of community standards. She made it sound like allowing wind chimes would somehow lead to the downfall of Western civilization. When she finished, Karen Schultz, the retired teacher on the board, raised her hand. "Patricia, I have a question." We've never had a formal complaint about wind chimes before Mr. Davidson's. Why are we amending the covenants now? Because we need to address the issue proactively before it becomes a widespread problem. But it's not a problem, Jerry, the wrong shade of beige mailbox guy, called out from the audience. The only person who seems to think it's a problem is you. Patricia's face hardened. Public comment will be taken in an orderly fashion. Please raise your hand and wait to be recognized. Jerry raised his hand. Patricia reluctantly pointed to him. I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, Jerry said, standing up. In that time, I've seen Patricia use the HOA rules as a weapon against anyone she personally doesn't like. This amendment isn't about protecting the neighborhood. It's about control. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. More hands went up. Patricia looked like she wanted to refuse to call on anyone, but with this many residents present, she couldn't just ignore them. Lisa spoke next. I have wind chimes. So do the Martins, the Chens, and the Rodriguezes. Are you planning to cite all of us if this passes? The amendment would apply to everyone equally, Patricia said stiffly. Like the rules applied equally when you cited my house numbers but not your own, I interjected. Patricia glared at me. That's a separate matter. Is it though? Robert stood up. Because it seems like there's a pretty clear pattern here. You enforce rules against people you don't like and ignore violations by your friends. Tom Henderson, the board member, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew his own wind chimes were technically louder than mine, a fact that hadn't been lost on the other board members since our hearing. The comment period went on for nearly an hour. Resident after resident stood up to speak against the amendment. Some shared their own stories of arbitrary enforcement. Others simply argued that wind chimes were a harmless decoration that shouldn't be banned. A few people spoke in favor of the amendment, mostly Patricia's friends, but they were vastly outnumbered. Finally, Patricia called for the vote. Per the HOA bylaws, amendments required a 2/3 majority of all homeowners, not just those present. With 230 homes, that meant we needed at least 154 votes in favor for the amendment to pass. The board counted the votes from residents present, plus the proxy votes that had been submitted in advance. It took about 20 minutes. When Karen Schultz announced the results, I could see Patricia's face fall. Votes in favor of the amendment, 42, votes against, 98. Abstentions, 12. The amendment fails. The room erupted in applause. Patricia sat frozen in her seat, staring at the vote tally as if she couldn't believe it. For the first time since this whole thing started, she looked genuinely defeated. The meeting adjourned shortly after. As residents filed out, several people came over to shake my hand and thank me for organizing the opposition. Sandra hugged me. Jerry clapped me on the back and invited me to a barbecue at his place the following weekend. I thought that would be the end of it. The wind chimes were legal, the amendment had failed, and Patricia had been thoroughly embarrassed in front of the entire neighborhood. Surely she would move on, but I had underestimated just how obsessed she had become. In early August, I was working from home one afternoon when I heard a strange noise coming from my backyard. I looked out the window and saw Patricia in my yard, standing on a ladder, reaching for my wind chimes. I ran outside. What the hell are you doing? She spun around, nearly losing her balance on the ladder. These are causing damage to community property. What community property? This is my backyard on my property. The sound carries to other properties, therefore it affects the community. Get off my property right now or I'm calling the police. You don't have the authority to. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Patricia's eyes widened. She climbed down from the ladder and hurried toward the back fence that separated our properties. This isn't over, she called back. You're trespassing, I shouted after her. Stay off my property. The Gilbert Police Department sent an officer over about 15 minutes later. I explained the situation, showed him the back gate that Patricia must have come through, and mentioned the ongoing dispute over the wind chimes. The officer took notes and said he would file a report. You want to press charges for trespassing? he asked. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to, just to make a point, but I also didn't want to escalate things further if it wasn't necessary. Not right now. But I want it documented in case she does it again. The officer nodded. That's reasonable. I'd also recommend getting some security cameras installed just to protect yourself. That was good advice. The next day, I ordered a set of outdoor security cameras and had them installed over the weekend. One covered my front door and driveway, one covered my backyard, and one covered the side gate. They were connected to my phone, so I would get alerts whenever they detected motion. The cameras proved to be a wise investment. 3 days after installation, at around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the backyard camera. I opened the app and saw Patricia, dressed in dark clothing, trying to climb over my back fence. I called the police immediately. While I waited for them to arrive, I watched through the camera as Patricia made it over the fence, walked across my yard, and once again set up a ladder under my wind chimes. This time, she had bolt cutters. She was actually going to cut down my wind chimes. I heard the police sirens approaching and went to my front door to meet them. 2 officers arrived this time. I showed them the live camera feed on my phone. They could see Patricia clearly on the screen, ladder and bolt cutters in hand. The officers went around to my backyard while I waited at the front. I heard voices, then some shouting. About 10 minutes later, the officers came back around with Patricia in handcuffs. She was screaming about how I was ruining the neighborhood and how the HOA gave her the authority to enforce the covenants. The officers were professional but firm, explaining that the HOA authority didn't include trespassing or destruction of property. You're going to regret this. Patricia yelled at me as they put her in the patrol car. I'll make sure you never have a moment of peace. One of the officers stayed behind to take my full statement. I showed him all the documentation I had. The original violation notices, the harassment citations, the video from tonight, and the previous trespassing incident. This looks like a pattern of escalating behavior, the officer said. She's going to be charged with criminal trespassing and attempted criminal damage. Given the prior incident, the judge probably won't be lenient. What happens now? She'll be processed and either released on her own recognizance or held for a bail hearing, depending on her criminal history and flight risk. You'll be contacted about pressing charges and may need to appear in court. I pressed charges. I had tried to be reasonable, tried to de-escalate, tried to find a middle ground. Patricia had responded by literally trying to break into my property and destroy my belongings in the middle of the night. That crossed a line. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next afternoon, everyone knew that Patricia had been arrested trying to cut down my wind chimes. The reactions ranged from shock to satisfaction to I'm not surprised. 2 days later, I received a call from David Park, the software engineer on the HOA board. Hey, I wanted to give you a heads up. We held an emergency board meeting last night and voted to remove Patricia as president. Tom Henderson is taking over as interim president. Wow, I appreciate you letting me know. The thing is, we probably should have done it months ago. Patricia has been abusing her authority for years, but most of us just went along with it because it was easier than confronting her. Seeing her get arrested was kind of a wake-up call. We're also going to be reviewing all the fines and citations issued in the past 2 years to identify any other cases of selective enforcement or harassment. That's really good to hear. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry you had to deal with all this. Your wind chimes are fine. Hell, I think we should encourage more wind chimes in the neighborhood. They're nice. Patricia's criminal case moved slowly through the court system over the following months. She was initially charged with criminal trespassing in the 2nd degree and attempted criminal damage, both misdemeanors. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had a good faith belief she was acting within her authority as HOA president, but the video evidence was pretty damning. The fact that this was her 2nd trespassing incident on my property within 2 weeks made it even worse. In September, she pled guilty to criminal trespassing in exchange for the criminal damage charge being dropped. She was sentenced to 1 year of probation, ordered to complete anger management counseling, and issued a restraining order prohibiting her from coming within 100 yards of my property. The HOA held elections in October. Tom Henderson ran for president on a platform of reasonable enforcement and community cooperation. He won easily. Patricia didn't run for re-election to the board, and I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was planning to sell her house and move. Good riddance. The whole experience had taught me some valuable lessons about HOAs, about standing up for yourself, and about how quickly a small dispute can spiral out of control when you're dealing with someone who cares more about control than reason. In November, Tom Henderson officially closed the review of past HOA citations and fines. The board had identified 38 cases of probable selective enforcement or excessive fines over Patricia's 3-year tenure. They issued refunds to 17 homeowners who had paid unjust fines, including Jerry, who got his $300 back for the wrong shade of beige mailbox. The new board also voted to adopt objective enforcement standards based on actual city ordinances wherever possible. For noise complaints, they would now require decibel measurements rather than subjective determinations. For landscaping issues, they created clear photo guidelines showing what compliance looked like. It wasn't perfect, but it was a huge improvement. I ran into Patricia one more time in early December at the grocery store. She was in the produce section when I came around the corner with my cart. We made eye contact. For a moment, I thought she might say something, maybe even apologize. Instead, she just turned and walked quickly in the other direction. I didn't chase after her. What would have been the point? She had burned down her entire life over a set of wind chimes because she couldn't stand the idea of someone not bending to her will. That was her problem to deal with, not mine. As December progressed, I heard that Patricia had indeed listed her house. It sold in mid-December to a nice young couple with a toddler. I went over to introduce myself after they moved in, bringing a bottle of wine as a welcome gift. They were friendly and normal, and they mentioned they loved the sound of wind chimes. We actually have a set we're planning to hang in our backyard, the wife, Emily, told me. I hope that's okay with the HOA, I laughed. Trust me, the new HOA board is very pro-wind chime. Christmas came and went. My wind chimes rang in the desert wind, the same peaceful melody they had been producing all along. I had spent 6 months and a few $1,000s in legal fees defending my right to hang a decorative item on my own property. But in the end, principle had won out over pettiness. On New Year's Eve, the neighborhood held a party at the clubhouse. Tom Henderson gave a speech thanking everyone for their patience during the transition and promising a fresh start for the Sagaro Hills HOA. He also jokingly suggested that wind chimes become the official symbol of the neighborhood. People laughed and applauded. As I stood there with a plastic cup of champagne, listening to my neighbors chatting and enjoying themselves, I realized that the whole ordeal had actually brought the community closer together. Patricia's reign of terror had isolated people, made them afraid to speak up or support each other. Fighting back against her had reminded everyone that we were neighbors, not subjects. Sandra came over with her husband. I heard Patricia moved to Tucson, she said. Good luck to Tucson. Think she'll find another HOA to terrorize, probably, but at least it won't be ours. We clinked our plastic cups together and toasted to a new year, free from HOA tyranny. As winter turned to spring, life in Sagaro Hills settled into a comfortable rhythm. The new board was competent but not overbearing. Enforcement was fair and consistent. People felt more comfortable personalizing their properties without fear of arbitrary retaliation. I added a second set of wind chimes to my front porch in March, a gift from Robert and his wife. These ones were made of bamboo and had a deeper, mellower tone than the copper chimes. Together, they created a layered harmony that I found incredibly relaxing. No one complained. No violation notices appeared in my mailbox. No one tried to sneak into my yard with bolt cutters in the middle of the night. It was, quite simply, how things should have been all along. In April, almost exactly a year after this whole mess started, Jessica Martinez called me. Patricia's probation officer had contacted her because Patricia had apparently mentioned my name during a counseling session, and the probation officer wanted to make sure Patricia wasn't violating her restraining order. "She's not," I told Jessica. "I haven't seen or heard from her since she moved." "Good, just wanted to check. How are the wind chimes? Still hanging, still legal, still making people happy?" Jessica laughed. "Best outcome we could have hoped for." Looking back on everything, I sometimes wondered if there was a way I could have handled things differently, some path that would have avoided the escalation and drama. But honestly, I don't think so. Patricia wasn't interested in compromise or reason. She wanted absolute control, and the wind chimes became a symbol of someone refusing to be controlled. The whole experience reinforced something I had always believed but never really tested, that when you're clearly in the right, standing your ground is worth the temporary discomfort and conflict. If I had just taken down the wind chimes when Patricia first demanded it, I might have avoided 6 months of stress and legal fees. But I also would have set a precedent that I could be bullied, and the harassment would have just continued in other forms. By fighting back, by doing the research and getting legal help and organizing my neighbors, I didn't just save my wind chimes. I helped reform an abusive HOA and freed an entire neighborhood from a petty tyrant. That's worth more than any wind chimes, no matter how nice they sound. In May, I was working in my garage one Saturday afternoon when Emily from next door came over with her toddler, a little girl named Sophia. They had just finished hanging their own wind chimes and wanted to show me. "They sound beautiful," Emily said, tilting her head to listen. "I can hear yours too. They harmonize really nicely together." Sophia was giggling and pointing at the wind chimes, delighted by the sound. I thought about Patricia, sitting alone somewhere in Tucson, still angry and bitter about sounds that brought joy to a little kid. Some people go through life looking for reasons to be upset, for battles to fight, for ways to make themselves feel important by making others feel small. Patricia was one of those people. The wind chimes were never really about noise or rules or property values. They were about power and control and what happened when someone said no. I said no, and I won. The wind chimes are still hanging. The sound ordinance proved I was right. And Patricia learned the hard way that HOA authority has limits, especially when you abuse it. As I stood there in my driveway, listening to the gentle melody of multiple wind chimes playing in the Arizona breeze, watching a toddler laugh with pure joy at the sound, I felt genuinely grateful for the whole experience. It had been stressful and expensive and frustrating, but it had also been worth it. Because some things are worth fighting for, even if they're as simple as the right to hang wind chimes on your own damn porch. The sun was setting over the Superstition Mountains, painting the sky in those brilliant oranges and pinks that make Arizona sunsets famous. The wind picked up slightly, and all across the neighborhood, wind chimes sang out in a chorus of different tones and pitches. It was beautiful. Jerry walked by walking his dog and waved. "Love the wind chimes, man. Best thing that ever happened to this neighborhood was you standing up to Patricia." I waved back, happy to have done it, and I was. Some people might think it's silly to spend 6 months and thousands of dollars fighting over something as trivial as wind chimes. But it was never really about the wind chimes. It was about refusing to be bullied. It was about holding HOAs accountable to actual laws instead of personal whims. It was about protecting everyone's right to enjoy their own property within reasonable limits. The wind chimes continued their gentle song as the sun dipped below the horizon, and I went inside to make dinner, content in the knowledge that sometimes fighting the good fight is worth every second of trouble it causes.